Hi everyone! If you're not familiar with Gary Francione, he's a prominent animal rights activist and staunch abolitionist, meaning he butts heads with people who promote welfare reform and reducitarianism. When it comes to animal rights, Gary and I are on the same page for the most part. I share his stance that veganism is the moral baseline, and promoting reducitarianism sends a conflicting message. But of course, you can agree with someone on one topic and strongly disagree on another. Recently, Gary got into some hot water by publishing an essay about trans rights on Medium.com. Medium removed the essay because, quote, "We do not allow content that may undermine the dignity and rights of transgender and/or non-binary individuals. This may include misgendering, deadnaming, claims that transgender individuals are not their gender identity, or erroneous claims based on disinformation or pseudoscience." According to Gary, I apparently violated the rules because I stated the fact that trans women are biological males. He's already obfuscating the situation because he said a lot more than that. He decidedly claimed that transgender individuals are not the gender they identify with, and made other erroneous claims based on disinformation, so it's no surprise that Medium pulled his essay. He then published it on his personal blog. In an Instagram post, he pleaded with his audience, "Please read my essay. If you have any counter-arguments, not unsupported assertions or defamatory accusations that I am transphobic, by all means, let me know. I haven't heard any yet." Challenge accepted. I read your essay, and I'll be responding with counter-arguments supported by facts and logic. So let's get into it. His essay, titled The Trans Rights Issue, Equality Claims and Belief Claims, starts out with a note that reads, "Principle 5 of the abolitionist approach to animal rights maintains human rights and non-human rights are inextricably intertwined, and that abolitionists reject all forms of human discrimination, including racism, sexism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, and classism, just as they reject speciesism." Many abolitionists have asked me about what the abolitionist position is about transphobia. The answer is clear. Transphobia is wrong. We should not discriminate against anyone based on their gender identity. Trans people should not be discriminated against in terms of access to jobs, renting or buying living accommodations, education, and elsewhere. This makes perfect moral sense. The fact that someone is trans is completely irrelevant to their access to employment, housing, education, etc. We do not, however, discriminate wrongly against trans persons by failing to believe their metaphysical/spiritual claims that trans women are literally women, or that trans men are literally men, and by failing to eliminate all single-sex spaces and activities, or otherwise not living our lives in conformity with their metaphysical spiritual beliefs. That is, it is not transphobic to refuse to embrace trans belief claims, any more than it is Christian-phobic to not accept that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, or Catholic-phobic not to believe that when a Catholic priest says Mass, transubstantiation occurs and the bread and wine become the body and blood of Jesus. To the extent that trans ideology requires us to ignore the basic human rights of biological women and girls, or to maintain that lesbians and gays who are not really bisexual are bigots, or to threaten the welfare of children, trans ideology violates Principle 5. There's already so much to unpack here. First, let's define transphobia. Transphobia consists of negative attitudes, feelings, or actions towards transgender people, or transness in general. Transphobia can include fear, aversion, hatred, violence, or anger towards people who do not conform to social gender expectations. Opposition is on a spectrum. Gary is not as transphobic as Matt Walsh or Michael Knowles, who want to eradicate transgenderism from public life entirely. But that doesn't mean he's not showcasing transphobia here. He may not hate transgender people or condone violence against them, but he clearly holds negative attitudes and feelings about them that are rooted in fear. He sees trans people, specifically trans women, as a threat to cis women, and trans ideology as a threat to children. As a proponent of secularism and progressivism, I wonder how Gary feels about Christians who support anti-discrimination laws for gay people, but still espouse beliefs like hate the sin, not the sinner. Would he claim they are not homophobic? Homophobia encompasses a range of negative attitudes and feelings towards homosexuality or people who identify or are perceived as being lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Aversion to gayness, such as the belief that gay sex is sinful, is by definition homophobic. Hating gay people is just an extreme manifestation of homophobia. The same can be said about transphobia. Gary's views are transphobic, though not in the extreme sense. Second, let's unpack the difference between being transgender and being Christian. Trans identity is based in the here and now. Transgender people, for the most part, are acutely aware of their biology. They choose to transition medically and/or socially to simply feel more comfortable in their skin or relieve their gender dysphoria. The belief that trans women are women and trans men are men is a belief, sure, but it's a secular one based on reason. Trans acceptance follows the same logic as gay acceptance. It's an observable reality that a certain percentage of the population does not feel aligned with the gender associated with their biological sex, and/or is not attracted to members of the opposite sex or gender. Gender incongruence, as well as homosexuality, are historically documented phenomena. We have data showing that gender-affirming care is the best treatment for gender dysphoria. We have data showing that gay couples are just as equipped as straight couples to raise children. Meanwhile, transphobes and homophobes fail to provide compelling data to the contrary. Religious identity, on the other hand, is based on belief in the supernatural. It's entirely faith-based. Gary is asserting that the belief that trans women are women is no less delusional than the belief in the Christian God. He's conflating a faith-based belief with a reason-based belief. I'll explain my reasoning as to why trans women are in fact women in a bit, but first I want to address this concept of Christian phobia. I don't consider myself to be Christian-phobic in the sense that Gary is describing, which is hatred or fear of Christians as people. But I do hold negative attitudes and feelings about Christianity and see it as harmful to society. So admittedly, I am Christian-phobic in a sense. However, if negative attitudes and feelings about something have a rational basis, is it really accurate to call it a phobia? When it comes to religion, I think terms like anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim or anti-Christian bigotry are more fitting, because what is actually wrong here is prejudice against Jews, Muslims, or Christians as people, not the rejection of Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. Gary is right that we don't have to accept Christian belief claims to respect Christians as human beings deserving of equality and religious freedom. However, in order to have freedom of religion, we need freedom from religion. A pluralistic society necessitates a secular government. The crux of the issue is whether the belief that trans women are women is a secular belief or a religious one. If it's a secular one, which I will argue that it is, then you are free to believe that trans women are men, but you're not free to impede on their right to live as women and use women's spaces. Jumping back in, his first section is titled, The Controversy. To say that the trans rights issue is controversial is very much an understatement. Part of the problem is that there is a great deal of confusion about exactly what issues are at stake. I would like to propose that the crux of this debate centers on whether respecting the equality claims of trans persons and not discriminating against them requires that we accept certain belief claims that at least some trans persons make. That is, does not discriminating against trans persons require we accept as literally true certain claims that they make, or at the very least that we live our lives as if we believe those claims to be literally true? A majority of us believe that trans people should not be discriminated against in terms of access to jobs, renting— Did I already read this? He's literally just repeating himself. This makes perfect moral sense. The fact that someone is trans is completely irrelevant to their access to employment, housing, education, etc. The problem is that some trans rights activists, TRAs, maintain that it is transphobic, among other bad things, to not accept as factually or literally true the claims that biological males who identify as women are women, and that biological females who identify as men are men. They also claim that, in light of the literal truth of these claims, it is transphobic to maintain single-sex spaces. They demand that we eliminate all single-sex spaces such as toilets, changing rooms, shower facilities, prisons, rape crisis centers, and domestic violence shelters, etc., as well as eliminate single-sex sports and make other changes that are intended to eradicate the concept of biological sex from society. So the issue is whether respecting the equality of trans persons and not discriminating against them requires that we accept these claims as true, or at least act as though we do, and eliminate single-sex spaces and activities, as well as make whatever changes would follow from our believing in the literal truth of those claims. Okay, what this boils down to is whether spaces should be segregated by chromosomes, sex, or gender. My personal view is that in certain contexts, gender or sex segregation makes sense, but in other contexts it doesn't. It depends on the reason behind the segregation. Regarding prisons, the reason for segregation is to protect women from sexual assault. So we have to ask, who is generally at risk of sexual assault, and who generally poses a threat? I think it makes sense to segregate prisons by gender rather than sex, because stats show that trans women are at risk of sexual assault by men, and they do not pose a threat to cis women. Regarding bathrooms, the reason for segregation is not very clear. Unlike prisons, public bathrooms are not hotbeds for assault. I don't really see an issue with desegregating bathrooms. If anything, this would benefit women because we wouldn't have to wait in such long lines. Regarding changing rooms, the reason for segregation is to protect women from voyeurism. But trans women don't tend to behave like voyeuristic men. Any woman who feels uncomfortable with a trans woman in the women's locker room simply needs to get over it. A trans woman minding her own business and doing what everyone else is doing in a changing room, changing, is not a threat to you. If she's behaving inappropriately and making sexual gestures, that's a different story. But if catching a glimpse of girl dick scares you, that's a you problem. It's not exhibitionism to strip down in a changing room, just as it's not exhibitionism to walk around naked at a nude beach. If you don't want to see strangers' genitalia, don't use public changing rooms or visit nude beaches. Anyway, policies that ban trans people from using the bathroom or locker room that corresponds with their gender identity are not only transphobic, but extremely stupid. Logistically, there is no way to enforce them, and they have the potential to backfire. They aim to protect cis women, yet there have now been reports of cisgender women getting harassed by transphobes in these spaces because they have a slightly masculine look. Regarding sports, the reason for segregation is fairness. For children, segregation serves no purpose. But for teens and adults, sex segregation, specifically sex hormone segregation, makes sense because testosterone gives males a physical advantage over females. However, in no context does segregation based on chromosomes make sense. A trans man may have XX chromosomes, but if he has undergone HRT, he has a physical advantage over women. A trans woman may have XY chromosomes, but if she has undergone HRT, her physical advantage is diminished. The argument then becomes, is it fair for her to compete against cis women if she retains a physical advantage having gone through male puberty? I don't think it's fair to exclude trans women with female hormone ratios from sports, when cis women with the same stature exist. Olympic gold medalist Katie Ledecky is 6 feet tall with broad shoulders. No one is up in arms over her clear physical advantage. Yet Leah Thomas, who is 6'1", sparked a media firestorm when she tied for 5th place in a college swimming championship. Gary goes on to praise gender-critical feminists. Many GCFs clearly and unequivocally support the equality claims of trans people, but reject TRA belief claims. That is, they maintain that an open and decent society should not discriminate against trans people, but they reject that we wrongly discriminate against trans people by refusing to believe that trans women are women, or that trans men are men. They do not support changes including, but not limited to, the elimination of single-sex spaces and activities, or changes that require that we reject the existence and importance of biological sex. GCFs are sometimes referred to as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs. TERF is viewed as a slur by many, and suggests that those with gender-critical views reject both the equality and belief claims of trans people. But that is not the case. The leading spokespersons for the GCF position strongly support trans equality claims. They reject just the belief claims. Also, GCFs do not necessarily embrace radical feminism, so that's yet another reason not to use TERF. He keeps reiterating that he, along with other gender-critical feminists, support trans equality. Yet they support segregation based on chromosomes, an arbitrary characteristic. Discrimination based on arbitrary characteristics is not equality. Also, the people claiming TERF is a slur are crybullies. I brought this up in my response to Mexi, who claimed the word carnist is a slur. Technically, any term that is used pejoratively is a slur in the general sense. This includes words like bigot, Nazi, and homophobe. As David Alsop points out in his Medium article, bigot is a slur. Of course it's derogatory to call someone a bigot, because a bigot is a bad thing to be, and it's not wrong or hateful to point that out. Just stop being a bigot. Claiming that bigot is a slur is simply a dishonest tactic of bigots to evade responsibility and claim victim status. Because when we think of the word slur, what immediately comes to mind is hate speech. The N-word, the R-slur, the F-slur, the T-slur. TERFs want to be viewed as victims of misogynistic hate speech. Not all transphobes are TERFs, as many transphobes are conservatives who reject feminism altogether. But TERF is an accurate acronym for people like JK Rowling, who spout transphobic rhetoric under the guise of feminism. Maybe TERF is more accurate for some, but gender-critical feminist obfuscates what they are, which is trans exclusionary. They want to exclude trans women from women's spaces. The next section is just a reiteration of his point about Christian phobia, conflating trans acceptance, a secular, reason-based belief, to Christianity, a religious, faith-based belief. Gary seems to think that if he repeats the same point in 12 different ways, it's irrefutable. As if he hasn't belabored the point enough, he goes on to compare gender transition to the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. This doctrine, which is not shared by other Christian sects, holds that when the priest celebrates the Mass, the bread and wine are literally transformed into the body and blood of Jesus. This is not just a matter of symbolism, it's a matter of spiritual ontology. The bread and wine becomes the spiritual body and blood of Jesus. Trans persons believe similarly that they have somehow transcended beyond the physical world and their biological reality. They can believe that they have transubstantiated if they wish, just as Catholics believe in transubstantiation. But just as Catholics cannot make the rest of us believe in transubstantiation and live our lives as if it were true, TRAs cannot make the rest of us believe in transubstantiation and live our lives as if it were true. I'm starting to believe that Gary is wholly unaware of the effects of HRT on the body. Regardless, bread and wine and body and blood are tangible things. Gender is not. This is not even remotely analogous. He then states a bunch of facts about biology, such as males produce sperm and females produce ova, and truisms like male and female are real categories. Like, bruh, we know. This is the Mott and Bailey that Contrapoints described in her original video on JK Rowling. It is very easy to defend the position that biological sex is real. It's not so easy to defend the position that trans women are men. Gary acknowledges that intersex people exist, but insists that their existence does not establish that there is a third sex or that sex is on some sort of spectrum. There are only two kinds of gametes, and therefore only two sexes. Variations within males and within females concern variations in anatomy, not variations in sex, and do not support the position that there are more than two sexes. Let's grant that sex is binary. This has no relevance to the question of whether trans women are women, because as he acknowledges, gender is different from biological sex. Gender is a set of cultural ideas and practices that are imposed on us on the basis of our biological sex. We can think of gender as evolving cultural stories about what it is to be male and female. Gender stories often become generalized into various standardized stories or stereotypes. These stories or stereotypes can and often do vary within societies and between societies, and can and often do change over time. Sex and gender are different. This is the fact of the matter. He goes on to say, TRAs use the expression cisgendered to describe a person who has the gender that person was assigned at birth. But no one is assigned a gender at birth. One's biological sex is recognized at birth, because sex is a fact that can be ascertained in all but a very minute number of cases, where there are severe anatomical variations. So one is identified as male or female. There is no assignment. There is a factual determination that is made. What sort of male or female person that person will become, how that person will express his or her sexuality through whatever gender roles or stereotypes will be imposed on that person, or that person will adopt, is not a matter that can be assigned at birth. That will happen afterward as that person interacts with his or her family, friends, society generally, and the world as he or she encounters it. If a biological male adopts the gender stereotypes of a female, that does not mean that male was wrongly identified as male at birth, and is really a biological female. It means the biological male does not identify with, or feel any affinity for, male stereotypes. In any event, biological sex is not up for grabs at birth or at any other time. What is up for grabs is what gender stereotypes, including a rejection of any particular gender stereotype, someone may embrace. On the one hand, Gary recognizes the difference between gender and sex, but on the other hand, he is conflating the two when he says things like, trans women may claim to be women, but they cannot deny that they are biological males. No one is saying that trans women were wrongly identified as male at birth. They're saying they were wrongly assigned the gender boy. He says no one is assigned a gender at birth. Their sex is recognized at birth. Like, what? Society absolutely assigns a gender to babies based on their sex. The vast majority of babies with female parts will grow up to be women, and the vast majority of babies with male parts will grow up to be men. So I don't think this gender assignment is inherently problematic. What is problematic is insisting that biological sex determines gender, and therefore one's gender assignment is fixed. He then says, to the extent that the trans belief claim is that we are born with some innate sense or feeling of gender that is separate from our biological sex, and that biological sex is irrelevant, that claim is and can be nothing more than a metaphysical belief. It is akin to the claim that despite our having physical bodies that have biological sex, we have souls or spirits or feelings that have a sexual identity that has nothing to do with our biological sex. If that is what someone wants to believe, it's fine. But to say that we all must believe that, and that we must change social institutions to accommodate that belief, is decidedly not fine. There is no requirement that we believe in souls or what appears to be analogous of souls. There are people who suffer from a recognized psychological condition called gender dysphoria. But genuine dysphoria, which until very recently has been rare, is a matter of distress or discomfort with one's biological sex, and not a matter of gender identity. And not any proof that biological sex is not a fact, or that gender and sex are the same. They are not. There is sex, and there is gender. TRAs cannot abolish the fact of sex, try as they may. To his point about souls, this is again an attempt to associate trans acceptance with religion. The idea that trans women are women does not hinge on the belief in a soul. Neuroscientists have yet to pinpoint the exact region in the brain where the ego, aka our sense of self, resides. But obviously, this essence is something that we all have. The same can be said about gender identity and sexual orientation. We don't quite understand how these things arise, but obviously they are part of our essence. The soul, on the other hand, is one's essence that is thought to be immortal. The ego/sense of self is a secular concept. It is observable, though not tangible. The soul is a religious concept. It's not observable. There is no evidence that our essence survives death. Trans rights advocates are not trying to abolish the fact of sex. That is nonsensical. They are simply trying to explain that gender is distinct from sex, and that both gender and sex are not black and white. Here are some other facts about biology. Chromosomes aren't the only biological sex marker. There are primary sex characteristics, and there are secondary sex characteristics. Male primary sex characteristics include the penis, the scrotum, and the ability to ejaculate when matured. Female primary sex characteristics include the vagina, uterus, fallopian tubes, clitoris, cervix, and the ability to give birth and menstruate when matured. A penis and vagina can be created, and a uterus and scrotum can be removed via surgery. Secondary sex characteristics, including breasts, fat distribution to the hips, facial hair, and a deepened voice, are malleable via HRT. Judging from the last few paragraphs, it sounds like Gary merely takes issue with trans rights advocates who claim that trans women are biologically female. Trans women may take issue with being referred to as biological males because it makes them feel othered, but they are keenly aware of their biology. Gary's insinuation that trans rights advocates insist that trans women are biologically female is a straw man. We may argue that trans women who have undergone medical transition are in part female due to their present sex characteristics, but what we insist is that trans women are women. Recall what Gary said earlier. We do not, however, wrongly discriminate against trans persons by failing to believe their metaphysical/spiritual beliefs that trans women are literally women or that trans men are literally men. He doesn't merely take issue with claims about biological sex, he takes issue with claims about gender. Trans women are women, literally. Trans is an adjective to describe a noun. A trans woman is a specific type of woman. There are tall women, there are short women, there are black women, there are white women, there are cis women, and there are trans women. They're all women. To say that trans women aren't real women is no different than the dairy lobby insisting that non-dairy milk isn't real milk. I have an entire video about this that is very old and very cringe, but I stand by the message, so I'll link it below. Soy milk is milk. Coconut milk is milk. Just because it doesn't come from the teat of a mammal doesn't mean it's fake, or that it shouldn't be classified as milk. Gary is clinging to a singular definition of woman, adult human female. This is an accurate definition of a woman, sure, but it's not the only accurate definition. Think about it. There are many things that cannot be defined in a singular way. Try to define a book in a way that includes every type of book. Not all books have content. An empty sketchbook is still a book. Not all books have physical paper pages. An audiobook is still a book. If you look up the word book in a dictionary, there are multiple definitions to account for different types of books. To insist on a single definition that is comprehensive is silly. That's not how language works. But the definition trans YouTuber Samantha Lux put forward should suffice. A woman is someone with the gender identity typically associated with the female sex. It's accurate, straightforward, and inclusive. I love it. The reason I say trans women really are women is because gender dysphoria is a well-documented phenomenon that has shifted our understanding of what it means to be a man or a woman. Modern medicine has made it much easier for trans people to pass, so much so that right-wing commentators often correctly gender trans people and then have to awkwardly correct themselves. Language evolves as our understanding of things evolves. I see no reason to cling to the traditional definition of the word woman, just as I see no reason to cling to the traditional definition of marriage. Moving on, his next section is titled, Abolishing Biological Sex Perpetuates Sexism and Misogyny. Although gender stereotypes differ from culture to culture, there is a disturbing constant. Gender stereotypes of women are predominantly sexist. That is, the cultural story they often tell is of the inequality of women. That is why many people have been working hard for decades to bring about a social rejection of gender stereotypes, or at least of the more egregious ones that objectify women as sex objects and otherwise as commodities. If we reject sex as a biological fact and say that only gender determines one's sexual identity, then we make gender the only reality for who we are sexually. And for women, that means that being a woman is only and necessarily a matter of being some sexist and misogynist cultural stereotype. These stereotypes include, but certainly are not limited to, being submissive, weak, nurturing, intellectually inferior, obsessed with appearance, overly emotional, terribly fond of doing unpaid menial labor, etc. We have made progress. Sexist/misogynistic stereotypes have less hold than they have had in the past. But making sexuality a matter of gender alone will necessarily affect that progress in an adverse way. By the way, gender stereotypes may not be a great thing for biological males either. The idea of being the strong, silent, tough guy who never shows emotions and controls or destroys anything in his path may in fact be making at least some men miserable. I have never cared much for traditional male stereotypes, to be honest. I reject completely the emotional limitations that gender stereotypes impose on men. I don't think you should trust a man who can't cry in the face of tragedy. I have never owned a gun or gone hunting. I have never been able to engage with cab drivers who often attempt to talk with male passengers about sports, because apart from knowing the different shapes of things that people throw or kick around, I know nothing about sports. If you are a biological male and don't identify with male stereotypes, but do identify with the gender stereotypes associated with being female, or if you think all gender stereotypes are nonsense, or if you want to pick and choose, that's fine. Identify with whatever gender stereotypes you want, and live your life accordingly. But that does not and cannot change the empirical fact that you are a biological male. Your adoption of a gender stereotype associated with biological females does not make you a biological female. It makes you a biological male who identifies as a female. Moreover, and very importantly, whatever female gender stereotype you may adopt does not in any way define what a woman is for anyone else except you. It's a cultural convention that you have adopted. It is not a reality that you can impose on anyone else or expect anyone else to adopt. All this talk of biological males and biological females is an appeal to nature. Modern science allows people to medically transition to the opposite sex. Just because you don't share every characteristic of a natural-born female doesn't mean you're not female. A trans woman who has undergone HRT and SRS is in part female. This isn't a rejection of the fact of sex. It's the acknowledgement that sex is fairly, though not entirely, malleable. It's true that many gender stereotypes are rooted in sexism, but this doesn't mean that accepting trans identity perpetuates misogyny. I'm trying really hard to understand his argument, but I'm struggling. He says, if we reject sex as a biological fact, and say that only gender determines one's sexual identity, then we make gender the only reality for who we are sexually. And for women, that means being a woman is only and necessarily a matter of being some sexist and misogynist cultural stereotype. This is a very convoluted straw man that conflates sexuality with gender identity. Like, who is rejecting sex as a biological fact? Or saying only gender determines one's sexual identity? Trans people are the first to reject the idea that gender identity is simply a matter of adherence to cultural stereotypes. Gender itself is a social construct, while gender identity is one's self-concept relating to gender. There's a difference between a transgender boy and a tomboy. They both adhere to masculine stereotypes, but they have different internal perceptions of their gender. The idea that trans rights advocates are out here trying to pressure or persuade your tomboy daughter to transition is absurd. We acknowledge the distinction between gender and gender identity, and therefore we accept people's gender identities whether or not they adhere to certain gender stereotypes. I feel like the undertone of this section is that trans women make a mockery of women and set us back by perpetuating sexist stereotypes. There are plenty of trans women who aren't hyperfeminine, but those who are don't perpetuate sexist stereotypes any more than hyperfeminine cis women do. And living in a transphobic and misogynistic society exacerbates gender dysphoria, pushing trans women to play a more stereotypical feminine role than they otherwise would. Generally speaking, trans women are not purveyors of the patriarchy. They're oppressed by it. He then argues, abolishing biological sex makes gays and lesbians bigots. A particularly bizarre manifestation of the TRA treatment of sex and gender is found in claims that it is bigotry or sexual racism for lesbians to be same-sex attracted rather than same-gender attracted. That is, some TRAs claim that lesbians are bigots if they do not want to have sexual relationships with biological males who identify as trans women and as lesbians. The same thing is happening to gay men, who are being shamed for not wanting to have sexual relationships with biological women who identify as gay men. This is unquestionably a violation of the equality rights of lesbians and gays. Homosexuality is a matter of being same-sex attracted, not being same-gender attracted. Trans women may claim to be women, but they are biological males who do not appeal to lesbians. That does not make lesbians transphobes, it just makes them lesbians. If a lesbian decides she is really bisexual and is attracted to trans women, that's obviously her right. But it beggars belief to say that if a lesbian is not really bisexual, then she is a bigot. It beggars belief to say that unless a gay man is really bisexual and willing to have sex with a biological woman who identifies as a gay male, he is a bigot. That would be to declare as bigots or sexual racists all same-sex attracted people. That would be to erase homosexuality. That is bigotry. Some argue that if a lesbian is not attracted to a trans woman, or a gay man is not attracted to a trans man, that is merely a cultural prejudice that is no different from not being attracted to members of other races, and that reflects a morally objectionable prejudice. I accept that sexual attraction is, at least in part, a matter of cultural conditioning. And I have no doubt that in a place like the US, which has had race-based slavery until 1865, Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation until the 1960s, and miscegenation laws until 1967, sexual attraction based on race was and still is influenced by all of that. I am not sure that I would say blacks or whites are racists or bigots for not being attracted to each other, but that is already in the process of changing significantly as we get further away from the racism that has so adversely affected society. But I do not think that recognizing our sexual attraction to members of other races can be, and in some cases certainly is, shaped by prejudice, and that in an ideal society, prejudice would cease to be a factor at all in attraction, commits us to say that in an ideal society we would all be bisexual. To say that anything other than bisexuality is bigotry is nonsense, and homophobic. He states with confidence that homosexuality is a matter of being same-sex attracted, not being same-gender attracted. Trans women may claim to be women, but they are biological males who do not appeal to lesbians. Says who? Wikipedia defines homosexuality as a sexual attraction, romantic attraction, or sexual behavior between members of the same sex or gender. Of course it's nonsense to say that anything other than bisexuality is bigotry. But trans rights advocates are not saying this. We believe that trans women are women, and therefore a lesbian or straight man's attraction to a trans woman is not bisexual. It's only bisexual if you believe that trans women are men. It's true that lesbians and straight men are not typically attracted to male genitalia. Excluding people with male genitalia from your dating pool is not bigotry. However, not all trans women have male genitalia. Therefore, the comparison to racial prejudice in dating is apt. It's important to analyze our preferences, as they can be rooted in bigotry. At the end of the day, you can be as selective as you want when it comes to dating. The problem is vocalizing your aversion to dating certain groups of people. Putting super straight in your Tinder bio is transphobic, just as putting no Asians in your bio is racist. If you're unfamiliar with the term super straight, it's basically code for I don't date trans people. And considering there are groups like LGB Alliance petitioning to drop the T, transphobia exists in the gay community as well. Next, Gary digs into the issue of female-only spaces. Another empirical fact that cannot be disputed is that biological males engage in a great deal of violence against biological females, and violence against women and girls is increasing. Let's be clear, violence against women is based on their biology, not their gender identity. That is, sexual batteries are performed with sex organs and larger body size/strength. It's not a matter of gender, it's a matter of sex. One of the primary reasons that female-only spaces were established was to address the concerns about violence from biological males. In addition, these spaces provide some protection for women from the exhibitionism and voyeurism of biological males, behaviors that may not involve physical violence, but certainly involve psychological violence and are extremely common. Until the advent of trans activism, we have accepted without question that it is the right of biological women to not have biological males in toilets, changing rooms, shower rooms, rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, prisons, and in other situations where biological women are vulnerable as biological women. This is not to say that society has provided sufficient protection to women and girls by any means, in light of the considerable violence that they suffer, but it has provided some protection. This minimal protection in the form of single-sex spaces for females is now the target of TRAs. Why? The answer is that at least some trans women do not feel safe in male-only spaces because they fear violence from biological men. Trans women want to be protected from biological males who seek to do them harm. Alternatively, they may just feel uncomfortable around biological males who don't identify as trans women. But those are exactly the reasons that biological females do not want biological males in their private spaces. Please think about this for a second. TRAs are demanding that biological women welcome biological males into their private spaces because trans women, who are biological males, don't feel safe or comfortable with/around other biological males. But neither do many biological women. The TRA demand is that we must ignore that biological females also do not feel safe or comfortable around biological males, irrespective of how they identify, in order to satisfy the demands of TRAs. There is a clear problem here. The TRA insists on the very same right, to not be with biological males, that they maintain we must deny to biological females. And which biological males are women supposed to welcome into their private spaces? Part of trans ideology is that gender is a matter of self-identification. If someone says, or just thinks, that they're a woman, they can freely use the private spaces of biological women. That is, any biological man can identify as a woman and insist on entry into single-sex spaces. Indeed, a biological male who is gender fluid may identify as a man today and be happy to use the men's toilet, shower, or changing facilities, but may identify as a woman tomorrow and want to use the women's facilities. In those places where self-ID applies, depending on the jurisdiction, there may be steps required to change one's sex or gender legally on government documents such as birth certificates, driver's licenses, and passports. But the principle of self-identification means no medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria or medical treatment is required, and as a practical matter, self-identification means any biological male can enter women's spaces. Is there a violation of equality rights here? You bet there is. There is a blatant and egregious violation of the rights of biological women. It is discrimination against them because the similar interests of biological women are treated differently and accorded less protection than the interests of trans women. Treating similar cases in a different way is the very definition of being unfair. It is discrimination because biological women are being forced to believe someone else's metaphysical or spiritual belief, and to rearrange their lives on the basis of that belief and give up a right they have. It makes no sense to claim that you are being discriminated against if what you are asking for is the same right you want to take away from someone else, and you have no plausible argument that your claim of rights trump their claim of right. Both biological women and trans women are asserting the same interest, to be in the same— oh my god, this is so fucking repetitive. Okay, both biological women and trans women are asserting the same interest, to be in a space without biological men. But this interest cannot be satisfied for both biological females and trans women if they are going to be in the same space. So, if biological females and trans women are going to be in the same space, biological females are going to have to relinquish protection for their interest. There is no legitimate basis on which to argue that trans women have a right to feel safe or comfortable that involves their not being in the presence of biological males, but that biological females do not have the same right. That is, in order— oh my god. Get an editor, please. Anyways, where was I? That is, in order to treat trans women equally, we have to treat biological women unequally to compel them to accept as literally true the claim that trans women are women, and admit them into their private and intimate spaces. In an effort to claim that TRA rights should trump the rights of biological females, some claim that trans women are more likely to be the target of violence than are the biological women in the spaces trans women want to share, and so the claims of trans women is stronger. But that claim ignores that trans women are not at risk of being harmed by biological women. They are at risk of being harmed by biological males, the very same group that put biological females at risk. It is also unfair to say that the concern expressed by women to preserve their private spaces is a manifestation of transphobia. The fact that women are happy to share their private spaces with trans men, many of whom, by the way, also don't want to use the spaces of biological men, shows that biological women are not transphobic. Their concern is not about people being trans. The concern is about people being biological males, regardless of how they self-identify. This entire argument hinges on the validity of his claim from the beginning, that violence against women is based on their biology, not their gender identity, and that sexual batteries are performed with sex organs and larger body size/strength. This is outrageously stupid for a multitude of reasons. It ignores the natural variance in strength, size, and testosterone levels among cisgender women and men. It ignores the effects of HRT and SRS. It ignores male victims of sexual assault. And most importantly, if this claim were true, there would be evidence that trans women pose a statistically significant threat to cis women in women's-only spaces. Gary has presented no such evidence. There is evidence that men pose a statistically significant threat to both cis and trans women in certain spaces, which is why it makes sense to segregate those spaces based on gender. This whole thing is the epitome of a moral panic. Dangerous men don't have to pretend to be women to walk into public bathrooms and locker rooms and harm women. They can just walk in. What should be policed in these spaces is harmful behavior such as exhibitionism, voyeurism, and physical assault, not physical appearance. There is no need to pass laws to ban transgender people from using facilities that correspond with their gender identity, when the behaviors that you're worried about them committing are already illegal. Gary insists there is a violation of rights here. In what sense are trans women infringing on the rights of cis women by merely existing in the same space? What rights are we even talking about? The next few sections I'll skip as he reiterates points I've already addressed. God, this is repetitive. He then asks, what about race, age, species? The TRA claim is that we can ignore biological facts because our sex is a matter of our lived experience, or choice, or innate feeling of sexuality, or whatever. The facts are irrelevant. All that is relevant is how we identify. But the postmodern rejection of facts cannot be limited to just the lived experience of sex. If we accept the claim that one can be a woman or a man simply by identifying as a woman or a man, what about other identity claims based on lived experience, choice, etc.? That is, we are being asked to accept as literally true that biological men are women, and biological women are men, based on their claims of gender identity. So on what basis can we exclude other claims that ignore physical reality, but are as sincerely held as matters of gender self-identification? What is the principle that limits the ability to make claims based on identity? That's easy. There is no basis. There is no limiting principle here. There can be no limiting principle here. We can exclude other identity claims only in an unprincipled or arbitrary way. For example, as Richard Dawkins and others have asked, if sex, which is biologically determined and binary, is really a matter of self-identification, then why isn't race, which is also biologically determined, but much less binary, also a matter of self-identification? So if I identify as black, why aren't I black? Why aren't you transphobic if you don't accept my transracial claim as literally true? People excoriated. I don't know how to say that word. Excoriated? Excoriated? People
excoriated
Rachel Dolezal, a white woman who had long been a campaigner for civil rights and had consistently claimed to be black, and who did not want to experience life as a white person. Why was she
excoriated?
To the extent that trans activists even reply to this substantively, i.e., don't just call you a transphobe or Nazi, or worse, and walk away. There are usually two responses. The first is that white people cannot know the oppression of black people. I completely understand that. Indeed, I agree with it. In a racist society, it is simply not possible for a member of the racially favored group to understand the lived experience of a member of the oppressed group. If I am a poor white person, I may have some understanding of the class component of racism. I cannot have an understanding of the race component. But it is also impossible for a biological male, however he identifies, to understand the lived experience of a biological woman, particularly in a patriarchal society. The second response is that trans people are just recognizing their innate sense of gender, and there is no innate sense of race. Who says? Once we say that a biological male can have the spirit or soul or innate feeling or whatever of being a woman, and that makes the trans person a woman, what possible argument can be made that a white person, and keep in mind that race is less binary than sex, cannot have the soul or spirit or innate feeling of being black or of being Korean? As I was finishing the final draft of this essay, I saw a news report about those who practice RCTA, race change to another. There is now a debate about this. But then, how could there not be a debate about this? That's my point. And it doesn't stop at transracialism. Trans woman Dylan Mulvaney sometimes identifies as a 6-year-old girl, as well as a toy doll. I have been vegan for decades. I do not feel my age or anything near it. My lived experience is very much that of a younger person. Can I identify as a younger person, get a redated driver's license, and demand lower life insurance rates? If I had not been a vegan and felt older than my chronological age, as do many of my non-vegan friends, should I be able to collect Social Security payments sooner? There have been reports of humans identifying as animals. Why can't humans be trans species? I've seen TRAs dismiss the trans species situation as silly. But it wasn't long ago that the position that a biological man can really be a woman was considered as silly. Okay, age and species may be social categories, but they're not social constructs like gender and race are. Your age represents how long you've been alive. Your species is based on who you can produce fertile offspring with. These things are not arbitrary. They cannot be altered. However, race is similar to gender in that it's a social construct based in part on physical attributes that can be altered to a certain extent. Rachel Dolezal was able to pass as black. Many people of color are considered white passing. But for whatever reason, gender dysphoria is recognized as legitimate by the medical community, while race dysphoria is not. Perhaps this is because the experience of gender dysphoria is far more prevalent and historically documented. I can accept that some people may feel some type of race incongruence if they grew up in a multicultural environment and they don't feel like their race matches their cultural identity. However, this concept of being transracial is almost entirely hypothetical. We just don't see race dysphoria manifesting in populations anywhere near the degree that gender dysphoria does. And the few representatives of the transracial community that we see are dishonest grifters. Rachel Dolezal lied about her background and claimed to be the daughter of a black man who was the victim of police brutality. Ollie London now denounces his trans-Korean identity and is using the platform he gained to spread anti-trans propaganda. This topic is almost exclusively brought up to make a mockery of trans people. To me, this suggests that being transracial is not really a thing. Obviously, there are people who identify as transracial, but I think something else is going on in their psyche that is not quite analogous to gender dysphoria or gender incongruence. Next, he cries, "Think of the children!" A note about children. I assume that, if you accept what I'm saying up to this point, I do not need to convince you that we at least need to be having a serious social discussion about whether and under what circumstances we should be administering hormones to and doing surgery on gender nonconforming children, involving irreversible body changes and lifelong medicalization. There are a number of issues here, and medical authorities are increasingly questioning the science behind and benefits provided by these procedures. We at least need to be having a discussion when government-funded psychologists tell us that we need to consider prioritizing gender-affirming care over the health of a child, and let pregnant trans men take testosterone despite it being a known risk to the children. But the TRA crowd is having none of it, and is continuing to promote these procedures and fight legal attempts to restrict access to them, and to claim that anyone who thinks that we should be discussing this matter is condemning a trans kid to death and denying gender-affirming care. If you don't accept what I'm saying up to this point, my guess is that there is nothing I could say to convince you that we at least need to be having a social discussion about those matters. Gary doesn't say much here aside from, we should have a serious discussion about this. Sure, we should have that discussion. Medicine involves a risk-benefit analysis. Of course there are risks associated with puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries. I'm sure there are clinics that are too quick to prescribe drugs to children, but this is a problem with our healthcare systems in general. Trans people and trans rights advocates as a whole shouldn't be blamed for this. Medicalizing children who display any level of gender nonconformity is not part of the trans agenda. The idea that trans men should be able to stay on testosterone while pregnant represents a majority view among trans rights advocates is absurd. The only reason he brought this up was to portray trans people as deranged narcissists who don't care about the health and well-being of children. He wraps up by reminding us that he is a progressive, not a conservative. If anyone is more in line with the right, it's those radical TRAs. He says, TRAs often behave very much like the far right. Try arguing with someone from the far right. They ignore you or dismiss facts and call you a communist, socialist, or Marxist, or at the very least question your patriotism. There is no reasoned analysis. Try arguing with a TRA. There is no discussion. They just call you a transphobe, Nazi, or fascist, or declare that even questioning TRA belief claims represents part of the genocidal final solution for trans people. Gary either isn't aware of intelligent and rational trans advocates like Contrapoints or Jammidodger, or he's just being dense. I don't know how anyone can watch Natalie or Jamie's responses to JK Rowling and claim there was no reasoned analysis. And I just want to say, Gary, if you're listening, I am willing to have a discussion with you. He then says, as a progressive, I am very concerned about changing language to remove words referring to females, example, mother, from the vocabulary, and reducing women in a dehumanizing way to their body parts and functions, such as womb carrier and menstruator, or as possessors of a bonus hole or of soft tissue used to chest feed babies. There is something terribly wrong when we are told that we must acknowledge that trans women, who are biological males, are women, but that we cannot refer to biological females except as body parts or body functions. How is this not a return to commodifying biological females? It sounds like he's been listening to Anna Kasparian. I get that some of these terms like womb carrier and birthing person are cringe. But as a woman, I am not offended by the attempt to make language more inclusive for trans people. Saying people who menstruate and pregnant people does not reduce women to their body parts or functions, nor does it erase women. Women are obviously included in these categories. It's not dehumanizing to acknowledge that not all women menstruate, including trans women and postmenopausal cis women, and not all menstruators are women, or that occasionally trans men and non-binary people can become pregnant. What's dehumanizing is excluding trans people by using the word women when you're specifically talking about people who menstruate or pregnant people. Exclusion plays a big role in dehumanization. And crucially, these phrases are only used in specific medical contexts. They're not used to refer to individual women. No one is calling you a birthing person, Anna. Lastly, he says, as a progressive, I am concerned about the violent misogyny that is promoted by some TRAs, and the failure of progressives, including supposedly progressive politicians and the police, to respond appropriately. Yes, there is certainly violence against trans people, and it must be condemned by all of us and stopped. But the both sides are violent claims from progressives are unfounded. Violence against the trans community is not coming in any significant way from gender-critical feminists. It's coming primarily from male bullies who feel threatened by trans people, gay people, black people, anyone other than straight white males. Violence against those who reject TRA belief claims is coming primarily from TRAs. Of course, you can always find examples of people with X ideology or identity behaving violently. But the questions we should be asking are 1. Does violence in the name of X occur to a significant degree? And 2. What is driving the person to commit violence? Gary presents no stats that show a significant degree of violence coming from trans people or trans rights advocates. He also ignores the fact that violence towards TERFs is retaliatory. I'm not condoning violence towards TERFs, but I wouldn't equate it to violence towards trans people. It's true that people like JK Rowling are not committing direct acts of violence. However, their rhetoric emboldens the male bullies who feel threatened by trans people. According to Wikipedia, stochastic terrorism refers to political or media figures publicly demonizing a person or group in such a way that it inspires supporters of the figures to commit a violent act against the target of the speech. Unlike incitement to terrorism, this is accomplished by using indirect, vague, or coded language that allows the instigator to plausibly disclaim responsibility for the resulting violence. Arguably, TERFs have played a role in the uptick of violence we've seen against trans people. Alas, we've made it to the end. Thank you so much for listening, and I think after this I'm gonna switch back to making shorter videos because this is exhausting. So stay tuned for shorter videos to come. Alright, peace out.